Executive Summary. Ordinary life in the Soviet Union was shaped by a continual tension between promise and constraint. The state offered powerful forms of security, guaranteed employment in most periods, heavy subsidies for housing and basic services, broad access to schooling, and a large welfare apparatus, but it also narrowed choice through political monopoly, a planned economy that routinely produced shortages, and a coercive state capacity that could reach into workplaces, neighborhoods, and even family and private belief. The result was a distinctive lived experience, daily routines built around institutions, the enterprise, the housing office, the school, the clinic, and daily improvisation built around cues, favors, informal exchange, and cautious self-presentation. The Soviet economy of shortage, as analyzed in classic scholarship on socialist systems, was not only an economic phenomenon, it became a social environment that trained people in patience, networks, and substitution. Life changed sharply at turning points. In the 1920s, the new economic policy produced a partial return of market relations after the emergency controls of the Civil War period, creating different rhythms of work and consumption than later Stalinist decades. A revolution from above at the end of the 1920s and early 1930s, collectivization and the first 5-year plan disrupted village life, accelerated urban migration, and transformed cities into crowded, rationed environments with intense administrative control. Modern social historians emphasize that shortages, housing crisis, and the conversion of everyday tasks into administrative battles, documents, permits, categories of entitlement, were not side effects. They were central to how the Stalinist system functioned for ordinary people. The Second World War brought mass mobilization, displacement, and acute hunger. Wartime and siege conditions pushed the rationing system to extremes, as in Leningrad during the winter of 1941 to 42, when daily bread norms fell to levels that could not sustain health. After Stalin's death, the social atmosphere loosened unevenly. Large-scale housing construction under Khrushchev helped millions move from barracks and communal apartments into small, separate flats, and welfare reforms, especially expansion and regularization of pensions, deepened the Soviet social state. Yet the late Soviet decades also preserved structural features that mattered in the home: persistent shortages, the indispensability of informal networks, BLIT, and limits on mobility, especially through internal registration systems. Across the USSR, experiences diverged. Urbanization was rapid. Census-based figures show that the USSR's de facto urban share rose from about 56% in 1970 to about 66% by 1989. Housing space per inhabitant rose in the late Soviet period, but remained modest by Western standards. Official comparative tables report about 13.4 square meters per inhabitant in 1980 and about 15.8 by 1989, public and cooperative stock. Health outcomes also varied by place and period. Late Soviet life expectancy oscillated. Official comparative tables show overall life expectancy around the high 60s, with clear gender differences. Earlier, published demographic analyses report major improvement from the late 1930s to mid-1950s, followed later by stagnation and uneven recovery. Southern republics tended to be poorer on average and more unequal in official income distributions released at the end of the 1980s, while some Central Asian republics had lower life expectancy than the Soviet average in published life table analyses. Because a single message cannot physically contain a full greater than 20,000 word script with dense evidence and tables, the text below provides a long, self-contained Part 1. The interpretive framework, key institutions of everyday life, and the chronological arc from 1917 through Stalin and the immediate post-war years, while also laying down the data scaffolding and charts requested. The remaining period, Khrushchev through Gorbachev, plus a fuller republic by republic comparative layer, is designed to continue in subsequent parts using the same calm, expository style and evidence base. Sources, methods, and interpretive principles. The Soviet Union generated vast quantities of documentation, censuses, statistical yearbooks, ministerial reports, enterprise records. But not all of it was published consistently, and politically sensitive series could be limited or suppressed. A striking illustration is late Soviet income distribution. Researchers note that publication of data on income inequality and discrepancies in welfare levels was taboo for most of Soviet history, and only in the late 1980s did official agencies begin releasing new series, including distributions by republic. This matters for lived experience history because what people could buy, how long they queued, and which privileges mattered often depended on hidden or semi-visible flows, subsidies, access channels, and informal exchange. To anchor everyday life in lived testimony rather than only in institutional self-description, several primary source families are prioritized: primary testimony and voices. The Harvard Project on the Soviet Social System collected summary transcripts and working notes from 700-plus interviews with Soviet refugees, offering rich descriptions of day-to-day institutional life from 1917 into the mid-1940s. Large oral history and documentary projects also exist for later decades and collapse, including Alexievich's oral history method in Secondhand Time, which assembles voices from the end of the Soviet era and its aftermath. For Stalin-era private life, major synthetic works explicitly built around family archives and testimony emphasize the interior world of ordinary households under repression and war. Primary administrative and statistical sources. For demography and social indicators, the USSR relied heavily on censuses, notably 1959, 1970, 1979, 1989. A USSR statistical handbook produced with Gooskomstat data provides comparable tables on population, urbanization, life expectancy, education attainment, housing characteristics, print culture, and travel, along with definitions and caveats. For specific welfare mechanisms, pensions, abortion law, and institutional form, internal passports, legal texts, and policy analysis are used where available. Scholarly synthesis and social history frameworks. For Stalinist urban life, a core interpretive anchor is scholarship that treats shortage, crowding, and administrative sorting as the ordinary environment of the 1930s city. For industrialization at the street level, city case studies built on archives and interviews provide grounded portraits of how socialism was lived in specific planned industrial communities. For consumption and late socialism, scholarship on Brezhnev-era consumer culture links policy debates to household aspirations and the social meaning of goods, fashion, and the home. For informal exchange, classic treatments of the second economy and later work on Blatt clarify why personal networks became functional infrastructure within a shortage system. Data quality and measurement humility. Household budget surveys existed and expanded, but researchers and archivists stress limitations. Documentation on Soviet family budget surveys notes that a continuous annual survey covering the USSR was conducted from the early 1950s onward, with sample size growing from tens of thousands of families and expanding in later years. But the very existence of such surveys does not guarantee that all constraints, privilege, unreported income, informal exchange, are captured cleanly. This script therefore treats quantitative tables as anchors, not as complete maps of lived reality, while using qualitative evidence to show how people navigated around what numbers omit. Chronological structure and major turning points. The Soviet period is often narrated as leadership succession or ideological contest. For lived experience, a calmer and more accurate approach is to treat each era as a bundle of household conditions. How food and goods were obtained, how housing was allocated, how one's biography interacted with the state, what risks were present, and what kinds of hope were socially plausible. Revolution and early Soviet social engineering. From the start, Bolshevik governance was not only about production and war, it was also a project of remaking social life. One of the clearest windows into the early ambition is family policy. Early leaders and activists imagined an eventual withering away of the traditional family through communal services, canteens, laundries, childcare that would socialize domestic labor and reduce women's unpaid household burden. Scholarly work on early Soviet family policy traces how this emancipatory vision collided with practical scarcity, administrative limits, and later political reversal. Early Soviet social policy also reveals a pattern that reappears later. The state swings between permissive legality and restrictive moral demographic consolidation. Abortion illustrates this rhythm. A 1920 decree legalized abortion, signed within the public health and justice apparatus, and framed explicitly as a health and social measure. Later, in 1936, abortion was prohibited. After Stalin's death, the ban was abolished by decree in 1955, with official reasoning tied to maternal protection and improved social conditions. These are not only legal facts, they shaped household strategies, whether a pregnancy could be ended safely, what risks women faced, and how families balanced wages, housing space, and childcare capacity. Education and literacy campaigns were another foundational intervention. Census-based discussions emphasize that literacy in Soviet Russia was very low in the early period. One chapter summarizing Soviet census literacy data reports that according to 1970 census-based retrospective estimates, literacy around 1920 in Soviet Russia was roughly 44%, with parts of Central Asia having extremely low literacy levels. The drive toward mass literacy later became a real everyday transformation. School attendance became a normal destination for children, even in families whose parents had little formal education, and reading became a central marker of cultivated citizenship. The new economic policy as a lived interlude. The 1920s are often remembered as an interlude of relative pluralism compared to the 1930s. In social history terms, NEP mattered because it altered how people interacted with goods and money. Compiled statistical and interpretive notes on Soviet economic history described NEP as allowing a private sector that was significant in some domains, while the state retained commanding heights, such as transport, communications, and banking. For ordinary people, that mix meant that everyday survival could rely more on market-like exchange than later, even though scarcity and inequality were still present and political control remained firm. NEP also mattered culturally. It normalized certain urban scenes, small shops, services, visible consumption that later Stalinist politics would condemn as bourgeois. This helps explain why the later abolition of the market and the return to rationing and administrative distribution felt like not simply policy change, but a transformation of daily tempo. Who could sell what could be found without permission, and what kinds of aspiration could be spoken aloud. Collectivization and industrialization as a new daily environment. The early 1930s are the decisive moment when everyday Soviet life, for many people, becomes recognizable as Soviet in the later sense, administratively distributed, shortage-driven, and heavily categorized. A leading social history of Stalin-era everyday life emphasizes several linked shifts. Collectivization and the first 5-year plan transformed daily life. Shortages of food and consumer goods became endemic. Peasants fled to cities, and cities entered acute housing crisis with communal crowding measured in square meters. Two practical consequences deserve slow attention. First was the administrative turn in daily existence. When goods are scarce, entitlement becomes central. Rationing in the early 1930s is described as a unified system with norms applied across the USSR and then later removed in stages. Even where exact norms varied by category and locality, the lived fact was that people learned to think in terms of lists, cards, workplace categories, and access points, where bread could be obtained, how factory status changed rations, what a clerk could receive versus an industrial worker. Second was the enclosure of mobility. The Soviet internal passports system, introduced in the early 1930s, became a tool for regulating movement and residence, binding people to places and making many forms of city settlement conditional. Scholarly analysis of the passport regime emphasizes that it shaped Soviet society by requiring documents and controlling registration, with the practical result that mobility was not simply a personal decision, but a permissioned process. The human result was a new kind of biography. A person's life story could hinge on a propiska, residence registration, a workplace assignment, or membership status that opened or closed doors, not only to jobs, but to housing and goods. This produced a distinctive Soviet skill set, learning how to speak to officials, how to gather stamped papers, how to keep one's file in order. Communal housing and the moral education of crowding was not only a shortage, it was a social condition that trained behaviors. Communal apartments, communal were often a system of enforced intimacy, multiple families, a shared kitchen and bathrooms, a strict moral economy of noise, smells, and suspicion. Historical description of communal living emphasizes distribution by authorities based on a norm of square meters per person, limited tenant choice, and low rents subsidized by the state. A housing crisis existed long before Khrushchev. A Soviet housing analysis notes that in 1950, estimated living space per person was under 5 square meters, and that universal crowding and communal life were pervasive. Soviet leadership after Stalin explicitly aimed to eliminate the shortage and built millions of units per year, even if size and quality lagged Western standards. Earlier analyses of housing policy likewise describe declining living space in the industrialization years and stress that underinvestment in housing was a cornerstone of Stalinist industrial policy. Crowding affected family life in quiet but profound ways. It shaped sleep, privacy, sexuality, and parenting. It also shaped politics. The boundary between private and public thinned. A kitchen conversation might be overheard. A quarrel might become a denunciation. A neighbor's complaint might turn into an administrative problem. This environment helps explain why later testimonies of Soviet life repeatedly mention whispering, silence, and the careful management of speech, terror, conformity, and quiet ethics of survival. The repressive apparatus of the Stalin era was not an occasional storm. It was a background pressure that reorganized how ordinary people calculated risks. Major works of Stalin-era private life explicitly foreground family archives and testimony about how households lived under the threat of arrest, exile, and stigma, and how this threat persisted through decades in the form of fear, silence, and damaged relationships. This did not mean everyday life was only terror. People still married, raised children, worked, attended school, went to movies, and celebrated holidays. The more accurate point is that ordinary life contained 2 layers, the visible layer of routine and the invisible layer of caution. A person could participate sincerely in official culture and still remain guarded. Sincerity and self-protection were not mutually exclusive. They often coexisted in the same individual. Documents compiled from the 1930s, letters, complaints, workplace narratives, show that many people used official channels to speak about quotidian misery, hunger, unfairness, local abuses, indignities. A documentary collection built to let ordinary voices appear in their own forms is explicitly anchored in such materials. This is crucial. Conformity was not only passive. People learned to use the state's own language to demand the state fulfill its promises. War and the extremity of loss. The Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, forced Soviet society into its hardest form. Hunger, cold, labor mobilization, and mass death. The Siege of Leningrad is a concentrated example of how state rationing, enemy encirclement, and administrative control combined into a daily struggle. Museum and scholarly summaries report that the lowest bread ration norms in late 1941 reached roughly 250 grams per day for industrial workers, and only 100 to 25 grams for dependents and children in the most desperate period. Historical summaries emphasize that the siege lasted roughly 900 days and cost hundreds of thousands of lives, largely through hunger and cold. The lived meaning of wartime rationing went far beyond calories. It changed the moral world. Food became a precious object of calculation, bargaining, and memory. Bread became an item that structured friendship and betrayal, care and shame, vastly more than in peacetime. Even after the war, many people carried habits of hoarding, saving, and distrust of abundance. War also reshaped demographics and gender balance. Post-war Soviet society contained huge absences. Missing men, disrupted families, and displaced populations. The Soviet state responded with a combination of restoration and control, rebuilding cities and industry, strengthening discipline, and promoting demographic recovery through family policy. Post-war reconstruction without private comfort. After 1945, ordinary people lived through Reconstruction in a society that still prioritized heavy industry and defense. Housing remained scarce, and many families continued in communal arrangements, barracks, or damaged dwellings. A CIA study of Soviet housing history describes a persistent and increasing shortage over the Soviet period and includes detailed tables on construction and per capita living space, underscoring how housing remained a chronic problem rather than a solved socialist achievement. Wages rose over time, but money did not automatically translate into goods when supply was constrained. Soviet statistical excerpts on wages report that average monthly money wages for workers and employees increased across decades. Figures such as about 33 rubles in 1940, about 64 in 1950, and higher later, showing long-run nominal growth while leaving open the question that mattered most to households: what those rubles could actually buy and how reliably. Here the concept of shortages becomes the bridge between macroeconomics and lived experience. In shortage conditions, household welfare depends not only on income, but on access, workplace distribution, special stores, connections, and time available to queue. Late Soviet income distribution researchers explicitly note that privileges and subsidies could be considerable in magnitude, while queuing itself functioned as a rationing device. Everyday dimensions of ordinary life chronology provides the skeleton. Everyday life provides the pulse: housing, work, family, food, health, schooling, leisure, belief, and the quiet strategies of coping. Housing as an allocation system and a daily sociology, urban housing, belonged largely to the state. This meant that getting an apartment was seldom like buying a home. It was more like entering a queue governed by the workplace, municipal authorities, and eligibility norms. Historical descriptions of communal living emphasize distribution by an established square meter norm and minimal tenant choice, while rents and utilities were subsidized and typically small in the household budget. This created a paradox. Housing could be cheap once obtained, yet painfully difficult to obtain in adequate quantity or quality. Communal apartments produced a distinctive social life. Kitchens became miniature public squares where families negotiated stove schedules, cleanliness, and the right to store food. Hallways and bathrooms became contested spaces. Children learned early the art of social navigation: when to speak, where to play, how to avoid disturbing adults, how to interpret neighborly moods. Elderly people, often guardians of rules, could become both protectors and enforcers. The Khrushchev-era mass housing program eventually shifted this ecology for millions, but even before that, the Soviet state's overall housing apparatus produced an official geometry of life. One's family size translated into square meters, one's job translated into priority, one's social status translated into speed. Late Soviet comparative housing statistics show gradual improvement in space. The average number of square meters of floor space per inhabitant, public and cooperative stock, rose from about 13.4 in 1980 to about 15.8 by 1989. Those numbers represented genuine improvement, yet they also signal how modest the private interior remained compared with many Western contexts. Amenities matter as much as space. Those same comparative tables report high levels of running water, sewage hookup, and central heating by the late 1980s for the measured housing stock, indicating that Soviet urban modernization did deliver infrastructure even when it struggled to deliver variety and comfort. Work, the enterprise, and the social wage. For most of Soviet history, the workplace was not only where one earned money, it was where one lived socially. Enterprises distributed scarce goods, offered access to housing queues, ran holiday facilities, and mediated social insurance. A historical analysis of Soviet trade unions emphasizes that unions were instruments of state and party, expected to promote labor discipline and efficiency, while also exercising significant functions in social insurance within industry. In many contexts, trade unions functioned like a benefits department, allocating vouchers for sanatoria and holiday homes and managing aspects of welfare that in other countries might be administered by separate bodies. This arrangement fits an older ideological framing. Lenin described trade unions' role under the dictatorship of the proletariat in ways that positioned unions as integrated into the Soviet state mechanism under party leadership rather than as independent bargaining institutions. For ordinary people, this meant that union membership often looked less like conflict with management and more like participation in an administrative structure that could provide rest vouchers, small material benefits, and channels for complaint, while also reinforcing discipline. Wages rose over the long run, but wage meaning depended on scarcity. Soviet wage tables compiled from official sources show average monthly money wages for workers and employees rising from the post-war decades into the late Soviet period, reaching roughly the low 200s rubles by the mid to late 1980s in some series. Yet even relatively high wages could feel thin if goods were absent or if time spent queuing was immense. The household therefore relied on a broader social wage, subsidized housing and utilities, free or low-cost education, and broad access to health care. Food, rationing, queues, and the craft of substitution food is where Soviet promises met hard reality most frequently, because food touches every day. The Soviet experience included several rationing and quasi-rationing phases. In the early 1930s, rationing was institutionalized as a unified system with norms and later removed in stages in the mid-1930s. During wartime, rationing returned in a harsher form. The siege of Leningrad remains the most extreme illustration. Official descriptions report bread rations falling to 250 grams for industrial workers and 125 grams for dependents and children during late 1941's worst interval. In non-siege contexts, late Soviet life often depended less on formal ration cards than on chronic shortages and queues. Shortage economics helps explain why queuing became normal, even without official rationing. In the economy of shortage, the household's problem is not only how much money exists, but which goods exist where and when. Time becomes a currency. Time spent waiting, traveling across the city for a delivery roomer, maintaining relationships with shop workers, or cultivating workplace distribution channels. The second economy and informal exchange became structural solutions to structural scarcity. The concept of a second economy is associated with scholarship that identified systemic informal production and exchange alongside the official plan. Work on Blatt explains how favors and networks functioned as an informal allocation mechanism, a replacement for markets in a society where markets were restricted and the plan often failed to match supply with demand. In lived terms, Blau was not only corruption, it was often experienced as mutual help inside a trusted circle, morally justified as necessary for feeding children or obtaining basic clothing. For researchers seeking household-level detail, Soviet family budget surveys exist as a crucial but imperfect window. Documentation on these surveys notes that an annual budget survey under the Central Statistical Administration monitored living standards from the early 1950s onward, with sizable samples and systematic variables for income and expenditure. At the same time, critiques of the survey's biases emphasize underrepresentation of extreme incomes and the difficulty of capturing informal flows. The everyday historian therefore treats budget surveys as one layer, always cross-checking with testimony about queues, favors, and informal work. Healthcare, medicine, and the lived meaning of free Soviet healthcare is often described through the Semashko model, a state-run system aimed at universal coverage, emphasizing prevention and public health in its early design. Scholarly discussion of Soviet and post-Soviet health systems often references this model as a foundational structure. For ordinary people, the core experience was access without direct payment at the point of service. Clinics, polyclinics, hospitals, combined with recurring limitations, underfunded facilities, variable quality, shortages of modern pharmaceuticals and equipment, and the need for informal gratitude payments or connections in some settings, especially later. The demographic record suggests both achievement and stagnation. A published life table discussion reports a major rise in Soviet life expectancy from the late 1930s to mid-1950s, from roughly the high 40s to around the high 60s, reflecting dramatic gains from control of infectious disease and post-war recovery. Later, official comparative tables show life expectancy fluctuating rather than rising steadily. For example, Soviet life expectancy at birth in the late 1960s to 1980s remained around the high 60s overall, with large gender differences, women notably higher. Public health crises, especially those linked to alcohol, accidents, and cardiovascular disease, help explain the late Soviet pattern of stagnation and sudden shifts. Schooling, youth, organizations, and the making of Soviet adulthood, Soviet education shaped daily life from early childhood onward. By the later decades, schooling was a near universal daily path for children in cities and many rural areas, while vocational tracks connected directly to enterprise needs. Comparative statistical tables provide enrollment totals and definitions for Soviet educational categories across the late Soviet period. The literacy story is especially important because literacy is a quiet revolution. It silently transforms family life, aspiration, and political communication. Scholarship and educational summaries report that illiteracy elimination began early in 1919, and that by 1959, literacy among ages 9 to 49 was near universal, with very high rates for both men and women. This shift mattered in the home. Letters could be read, newspapers consumed, manuals used, and children could become interpreters of the modern state for parents. Youth organizations formed another layer of everyday life. Britannica summarizes the Komsomol as the major organization for ages roughly 14 to 28, tied to spreading communist teachings and preparing future party members. It coexisted with the pioneers, younger children, and Octobrists, very young. Participation could be sincere, strategic, or both. It provided camps, badges, friendships, and opportunities. It also trained young people in the rituals of Soviet public language, speeches, collective action, and the linking of personal biography to national projects. Family life and gender roles across shifting policy Soviet gender roles were never stable. Early ideology emphasized women's emancipation through labor participation and socialization of domestic tasks. Over time, however, demographic and political pressures encouraged pronatalism and family conservatism. Scholarship on Soviet family policy traces the early radical ambition and later conservative turn by the mid-1930s, including legal changes that tightened divorce and restricted abortion. Abortion policy again shows how state priorities entered the private body. The 1936 prohibition had measurable demographic and health consequences in later research, including short-term birth increases and serious costs through unsafe procedures and female mortality. The 1955 relegalization reflects both public health reasoning and a pragmatic recognition that bans did not end abortions, but pushed them underground. In household terms, these policies influenced spacing of children, women's ability to remain in education or work, and the emotional burden of reproductive risk. Religion, belief, and the uneven secularization of daily life. The Soviet state pursued secularization aggressively in some periods, yet belief persisted in varied forms. Organized atheism was institutionalized through campaigns and mass organizations. A major study of the League of the Militant Godless documents how the Soviet regime sought to spread atheism through nationwide networks, propaganda, lectures, and agitation. Scholarly discussion of the 1929 Congress of the Godless situates the campaign within legal tightening, including the 1929 decree on religious associations and constitutional changes affecting religious propaganda. For ordinary people, religion became a matter of context and risk. In some families, icons moved from public walls into drawers. In some villages, rituals persisted quietly. In some republics, Islam and local traditions continued, sometimes openly and sometimes in careful compromise with official life. Belief could become a private language, sustained within family rather than public institutions. Mobility, travel, and the geography of permissioned Soviet space was vast, but movement inside it was conditioned. The internal passport and registration regime made residence a regulated status. Scholarly analysis emphasizes that passports and registration were not just identification, they were an organizational framework that structured access and mobility. The practical lived meaning was simple. Without the right stamp, one could not easily settle in a major city, obtain certain housing, or access some forms of employment and services. Foreign travel existed, but was limited and administratively managed. Comparative tables show foreign travel to the USSR rising across late Soviet decades, indicating the growth of managed tourism and international contact, even if ordinary citizens' own foreign travel remained far more restricted than in many Western contexts. Regional and social variation across the USSRA calm account must avoid treating the Soviet citizen as a single type. The USSR contained sharply different zones: old industrial centers, new industrial cities, Baltic urban modernity, Central Asian cotton and irrigation economies, Caucasus oil and mountain agriculture, northern extractive regions, and a vast rural world with its own rhythms. Urbanization and demographic structure census-based series show a steady urban trend in the late Soviet decades. In 1970, the USSR's de facto population totaled about 241.7 million, with about 136.0 million urban and about 105.7 million rural. By 1989, the de facto population was about 286.7 million, and the urban share about 65.9%. This shift reshaped everyday life. The city became the typical environment, and with it came apartment blocks, public transit routines, workplace canteens, and greater proximity to cultural institutions. But migration also produced strain. Housing queues lengthened, urban services creaked, and migrants carried village practices into urban space, creating hybrid forms of daily culture. Urbanization, therefore, did not eliminate rural life. It redistributed it inside cities. Republic-level differences in welfare and inequality. Late Soviet data releases suggest differences across republics. Researchers analyzing newly published late 1980s income distributions report that inequality was greater in poorer southern republics than in the north, at least in official income series, and likely even more pronounced if unreported income were fully included. This aligns with a broader structural reality. The southern republics often faced different labor markets, higher fertility, and different sectoral mixes: agriculture, light industry, extractive industries, affecting household incomes and consumption patterns. Health varied across regions as well. Published life table discussions emphasize that underdeveloped Central Asian republics could have lower life expectancy than the Union average in some periods, indicating durable regional health disparities inside a formally universal system. Regional difference is thus not a footnote. It is part of what ordinary life meant. Nationalities policy and everyday identity. Nationalities policy shaped daily life at school, at work, and in naming practices. Scholarship on Soviet nationalities emphasizes that the Soviet state integrated national categories into administrative territorial structure and used ethnographic knowledge to shape the very formation of the USSR, with real consequences for language policy, education, and identity. Work on affirmative action in the Soviet context highlights systematic promotion of minority national consciousness and institutions in the early period, alongside later tensions and reversals. For ordinary people, nationality could be both resource and vulnerability. Resource in access to local language schooling or cultural institutions, vulnerability in periods of suspicion, deportation, or stigma. This was especially true in wartime and during campaigns that treated categories of people as suspect. Rural life, collectivization, and the politics of hunger. Rural life was transformed most violently by collectivization and its sequelae. In Kazakhstan, for example, scholarship on the 1930 to 1933 famine emphasizes mass death and social transformation linked to forced settlement and collectivization using archival documents and testimony to reconstruct the lived catastrophe. Even beyond famine zones, collectivization reorganized village time. Work became organized through collective labor norms. Seasonal pressures were integrated into state procurement, and personal autonomy shrank. The rural-urban divide persisted throughout Soviet history, even as millions moved to cities. Rural households often had different access to private plots, informal food supplies, and local networks, while lacking some urban amenities. Urban households, by contrast, depended heavily on state retail and workplace distribution and were therefore more exposed to urban shortages and queues.